Hey everyone, this is Nick, and if you've been looking up stuff online about Linux, you absolutely have come across this phrase. This is the year of the Linux desktop. Is it this year? Was it last year? Is it next year? What does it mean? No one even knows. My opinion is that there will never be a specific year of the Linux desktop. But it's not because Linux is not good enough, will never grow, or will never win against Windows or macOS, whatever that means. Let's discuss. But let's also discuss why you should check out today's sponsor to get your own server running. Thanks to Linode for sponsoring this video. Linode is the best choice to deploy your own Linux or gaming server. Getting started is extremely easy thanks to their app marketplace. You can just pick from one of the many apps they offer, select a few configuration options, and just one-click deploy that server. It's super simple. It works for a development environment, but also for a Minecraft or Valheim server. Among the most notable apps, Linode has Moodle to create your own learning management system and teach and sell courses in minutes, but they also have stuff like Pi-hole to block ads. You can block mine, but it's gonna make me even poorer. From Focalboard, a Trello alternative to Rocket Chat, which is the equivalent to Slack or Teams, Linode has everything you would want. Click the link in the description to get your $100 credits and get started. So, is 2022 the year of the Linux desktop? No, it isn't. But what does that even mean in the first place? The general consensus is that the famed year of the Linux desktop is the year where Linux finally gets to a point where any average user would have heard about it and would have no reservations to install it themselves, easily on their own devices. It also entails that the general public would encounter no major issues that couldn't be solved very easily, either through a search engine or through tools available on the system itself. So basically, it would be the year where Linux is finally good enough for the average consumer, the average user. And there's also an added expectation that Linux would then start growing up and eat Windows or macOS's market share until it surpasses them. In my opinion, that is not something that can happen. But before you whip out your pitchforks and try to burn me alive, let me explain. Linux is already good enough. It might sound like pure fanboyism, but the vast majority of people using a computer don't need most of what Windows or macOS offer. They generally don't even know half of the features of these operating systems. They also don't need most of the apps available there. They need a web browser, and Linux has all of the web browsers. Linux is good enough to be used by the vast majority of people who could absolutely use LibreOffice for the very few times they need to write a cover letter, a curriculum vitae, or do a home budget. It's a matter of habit, not of quality. And so if Linux is good enough, is this the year of the Linux desktop? Is it already passed? No, because quality has never been the factor that would let Linux grow and finally beat every other OS. In terms of quality, Linux is already there. The Linux desktop has progressed in leaps and bounds over the past 10 to 15 years. Ubuntu made it more popular and well-known, and together with other user-facing distros and GNOME and KDE and the rest of the community, they made our desktops more usable, 100% usable, by any idiot, myself included. We now have automatic printer detection on networks, we have solid driver support from most manufacturers, we have tons of amazing apps that definitely can handle most people's needs. We have gaming with Steam, Heroic, Lutris, and the Steam Deck is proof of how well that works. We have more hardware support than ever before, with Dell, Lenovo, and even Razer selling computers with Linux pre-installed, albeit not very prominently. We have brand recognition thanks to Android and Chrome OS. Most people have heard about Linux, although maybe not on the desktop side of things. Fragmentation is a thing of the past, thanks to Flatpak, Snap, or app images. With these packaging formats, no matter what distro you use, you can run anything. Is that still fragmentation? Well, that's 3 ways of packaging your apps compared to the previous tens of packages you needed to support most Linux distros before. And let's be honest, most people just provide a Flatpak or a Snap. And let's be more honest, Flatpak is definitely the community's choice over Snaps. Also, our communities have never been as dynamic as they are today. We have tons of new applications, updates all around, all year long, on our desktop environments, on our applications, on the underlying technologies with Wayland, Pipewire, and Flatpak. There are very few things that you cannot do today on Linux that you could do on Windows or macOS. The quality of the Linux desktop cannot be questioned. So sure, some people will say that some stuff doesn't work perfectly for them. Some will say that they can't still play their favorite game. Some will say they hate Flatpak or Pipewire or Wayland or whatever modern system is being implemented at the moment. We have the quality. So why do people think Linux desktops aren't ready to begin the year of the Linux desktop? The issue here is that Linux is generally never compared on an equal footing with Windows or with macOS. People are comparing running Linux on a device that's never been designed to run it, running apps that they're unfamiliar with, or even running apps that have never been designed to run on Linux in the first place. That's not only unfair, it's also dishonest. We can't compare something pre-installed, for which hardware has been tested, to a freely installed piece of software that you decided to install yourself without the support of the manufacturer. We can't compare a program we've known and used for years to something we're just learning to use. We can't compare running a game made for a specific OS and set of libraries to running it on a completely different platform that was never intended to run it, at least not by the developers. Well, yes, we can, and it turns out we can even beat the native platform in some cases. Elden Ring. What I mean is that Linux is still, in the overwhelming majority of cases, a system you install instead of what the manufacturer chose to provide. This means that by definition, it has to work extra hard to offer the same level of integration and of hardware support. An apples to apples comparison, no Mac pun intended, would be comparing the level of functionality of a laptop with Linux pre-installed to the same laptop with Windows pre-installed. In these cases, a Linux desktop does work just as well as Windows does, and even outperforms it in a few cases, like resource usage, general reactivity, or privacy. Battery life, unfortunately, is still a sore spot, but who needs 17 hours of battery on their laptop? No one needs that. That's oh crap, my camera is dying. The point is, if we're going to try and argue that Linux isn't ready for most people, let's at least argue from an equal standpoint, with a system pre-installed on hardware, sold by a manufacturer. And then it becomes way harder to say that Linux desktops aren't good enough. But if the Linux desktop is good enough, then does that mean that the year of the Linux desktop has already happened? Well, no, not really. Because we're still not at a point where most people would even consider using Linux as their daily driver. There are still way too much bad first impressions floating around, too many preconceived notions about Linux. Dispelling them is also part of the process to make the year of the Linux desktop happen, and that can only come from using a Linux desktop itself. Can you see how this might be a problem? People don't use Linux because they're afraid it's too technical, or they don't know about it, or they had a first contact 5 or 6 years ago with it and they didn't like it. And then Linux doesn't get more use, and then those preconceived notions just never disappear. The actual quality of Linux doesn't matter. The year of the Linux desktop can only happen if people know and believe that Linux is good enough, not when Linux actually is good enough, which happened a while ago for me and probably a few years ago for most people. The quality doesn't matter if people don't even give Linux a try. And regular people will not install any OS from the internet and replace the default. People don't even replace most of the default apps on their phones, which makes the battle giant tech companies fight to prevent that from happening even more stupid, but that's not the point. If we can't get Johnny, my phone is fine as it is, to replace their web browser, how are we gonna get Jane, my PC works well already, to install Linux? And once again, we end up at the same point I've been trying to hammer over and over again. Linux needs hardware to be used more, to be known more. Hardware sold in retail stores. Hardware that people can actually try and buy. Once that happens, then sure, the year of the Linux desktop might start to happen. Until then, I don't think it ever will. And sure, as I mentioned, that part is slowly starting to change. We have big manufacturers selling laptops with Linux pre-installed. We have the Steam Deck, which might not advertise Linux specifically, but it's still Linux hardware. The issue is, these things aren't really available in retail stores, where people can open them, play around, look at the UI, get a feel for it, and see how fun and nice looking or speedy it can be. It's a first step, but it's not solving the issue, not yet. All of this hardware is still designed for enthusiasts mostly, not for the general public. There is also a notion that the Linux desktop needs to beat Windows or macOS in terms of market share to finally be successful, that it needs to overtake both of them. And fortunately, that is not the case, or the year of the Linux desktop might be even more impossible than I think it already is. macOS is proof that an OS doesn't need 50% or more market share to have a nice, healthy community. Well, healthy might be a bit of an overstatement, because most Apple fanboys will defend anything that has an Apple logo on it. If you think I'm trolling or I'm being hateful, just look at what people are saying to defend the position of the charging port on the Magic Mouse. Yeah. Linux also doesn't need to reach 50% market share to have some impact, to have more third-party app developers' attention, to have slots in retail stores and more. With about 8 to 10%, there would be enough of a market for companies to view Linux as a healthy potential market for their stuff. At 8 to 10%, you get the likes of Adobe, Microsoft Office, better versions of Zoom or Teams, better support for the latest Linux stack, like Wayland or Flatpak or Pipewire. At this kind of market share, you basically get what most people have been saying Linux lacks to grow. You get the apps that people already know and already use. I'm not sure which should come first though. The growth, which doesn't need the apps to happen, or the apps which definitely do need the growth to happen. Linux is currently at around 2% market share on the desktop. That's too small to matter for most people. Too small for retail stores to take a chance on selling Linux hardware, and too small for big companies to take an interest in. At 8 to 10%, you definitely erase most of these issues. And some will say that people would not buy anything with Linux pre-installed on it, because it doesn't run the same apps they're used to. And I totally disagree. People buy Chromebooks in droves, and Chrome OS doesn't run Microsoft Office, it doesn't run Photoshop, and most Chromebooks don't run Steam either. Still, these devices get sold. Linux devices in stores would also get sold. The year of the Linux desktop can only happen once the general public is completely comfortable trying, buying, and using a Linux device. Until then, it's an also ran that requires users to go out of their way to replace the default and deal with the potential hardware issues. This is why I think there will never be a year of the Linux desktop. There will never be a specific year where in Walmarts, in Fnacs, or whatever else, you find all of a sudden tons of Linux desktops and laptops. It will happen, but as a trickle, slowly, over time. It won't happen in 1 year, and so there will never be a specific point marked that means this is where Linux started really beating the crap out of Windows. The quality of Linux desktops is already absolutely good enough for most people. Whether you prefer GNOME or KDE or Cinnamon, all are good enough for most people. They're simple to get to grips with, they offer fast and fluid experiences, and all have a wealth of apps that anyone can get used to in a few hours of use. In a way, I think, no, there won't be a year of the Linux desktop, but there will be a decade of the Linux desktop, a decade over which Linux grows into its own and starts being accepted and used by more people. And I think we already entered that decade. In the meantime, it means that we will still do things as we've always done them, slowly but steadily. And we know what wins the race. Just like today's sponsor, Slimbook. These guys are based in Valencia, Spain. They make Linux laptops, Linux desktops. They have a wide range of keyboards. They ship worldwide, and their whole range of devices can cater to basically every need or every budget. From the Slimbook Essential, which is a small ultrabook on the cheaper side of things, or to the huge Slimbook Titan, which is a magnificent gaming laptop. They also have desktops, RGB keyboards, small form factor PCs. You name it. Anything you need, you can find on Slimbook's website. So head over to the link in the description below, Click it and see if there's something in their lineup that suits your needs. I'm sure you'll find a fantastic device with Linux pre-installed. So thanks everyone for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, don't hesitate to like, to subscribe, to turn on notifications, to write a comment. And if you didn't like the video, you can also dislike it and tell me why in the comments. If you want to help me make more of these videos, you can join my Patreon subscribers and my YouTube members. Both of them get access to the weekly Patreon cast on Mondays and the right to vote on the next topics I'll cover. So thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!